Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on a YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And remember, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And please remember, if you're watching on YouTube, to hit the subscribe button. And joining me today is historian and friend Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Daz, how are you?
Very good. And today we're going to be discussing the Vicksburg Campaign. And of course, it is the 160th anniversary of those events this year. So let's start, Tim. I'll just get my share screen up and we'll start. So just give us an idea of the importance of Vicksburg, Mississippi, to both sides, please.
So, yeah, it's a good question. So for the North, well, let's start with the South since they're defenders. They should get first crack since they had it. Come the end of 1862, the Confederacy has lost a number of strategic points in the West. They've lost Middle Tennessee to Grant and Halleck's campaign to take Corinth. They've lost Memphis, Island number 10, other strategic locations on the Mississippi. Probably more significantly, they've lost New Orleans, and they only really control a stretch of the river between Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is due south of, a couple hours south of Vicksburg, and Vicksburg, Mississippi. And Vicksburg is important because it's strategically located on the river. It overlooks a hairpin bend of the Mississippi, what's called DeSoto Point, or was called DeSoto Point back in the day. So it's very strategic and allows the Confederates to control that stretch of river with massive batteries sited on high ground. For the North, they want it for a couple reasons. The most simplistic is that by controlling the entire length of the Mississippi, which they will do if they can take Vicksburg and Port Hudson, they'll separate the Western Confederate states, Arkansas, Texas, much of Louisiana, from the remainder of the Confederacy. But also, and this is key for Northern farmers, they want to get their crops to market, and most of them were sending it down the river to New Orleans and then out that way. So they're really chomping at the bit to get the river open that way. But really, strategically, in separating the Confederacy's halves from each other was probably the biggest reason.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's move on to the commander at the time in this area, which is Ulysses S. Grant, Major General, and the Army of Tennessee. And they've had a lot of success, haven't they, so far, up until the start of the Vicksburg Campaign. So just go over what's happened during the 1862 period to get to the point where we're looking, or Grant is looking at, coming down and trying to seize Vicksburg.
Okay, so Grant, he takes over what eventually will become the core elements of the Army of the Tennessee. Late 1861, he'll take command at a place called Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio dumps into the Mississippi River. He will start to look for ways to take offensive action. The big obstacle at that point on the Mississippi is a city called Columbus, Kentucky. He will land kind of an expedition to just west of Columbus, a place called Belmont, fight a engagement there. Will rout the Confederates out of their camps, but a Confederate counterattack will basically rout him, rout his troops. He'll extricate his forces. He'll claim it was a good blooding for his troops, get them experience. It's probably a tactical defeat. But after that, in conjunction with Flag Officer Andrew Foote, he gets permission to take the stronghold of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. He does that primarily. That's a naval expedition. But as soon as Fort Henry falls, he drives straight for another fort located just several miles away to the east on the Cumberland River called Fort Donelson. And he takes Fort Donelson. Following a short siege, the Confederates try to break out. They are eventually repulsed, driven back in their defenses, and are forced to surrender unconditionally, though Grant ultimately does grant some conditions, ironically. That leads directly to the fall of Nashville. And as Grant hoped, what that did was it unhinged that entire Confederate defensive line that ran across Kentucky, all the way from Columbus through Bowling Green. So Albert Sidney Johnson's forced to fall back, and he leaves the entire state of Tennessee. He falls back to Corinth, Mississippi. Grant takes the first, technically, Don Carlos Buell's troops then move in, take the first Confederate capital to fall. That's Nashville. And then Grant ultimately, there's a little squabble. He's briefly relieved of command for not providing sufficient information to his commander. It was a big miscommunication. But he finds himself in command, back in command of his army in early April 1862. As we all know, the Confederates launched an surprise attack on him. Yes, Grant was surprised, though he would deny it his whole life. But would win a very bloody, at that point, the bloodiest battle in American history, fight at Shiloh. And then ultimately, Henry Halleck will come take command of the combined armies of the Tennessean Army of the Ohio, and will take Corinth. And Grant finds himself at towards the end of 1862, still in that vicinity, holding his forces divided between Memphis and Corinth, controlling a wide stretch of railroad. And looking for a way to get after the Confederates. He's then squarely fixated on Vicksburg at that point. But that kind of takes us up to the beginning of the official campaign.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the guy that is going to be in charge of Vicksburg, and that is Lieutenant General John C. Pendleton. So give us a little background on him. And from what I understand, he's a Pennsylvanian. So how does he end up in charge of Vicksburg and the surrounding area in the Western Theater?
Okay, so John C. Pemberton's an interesting character, yes, because he's a Pennsylvanian, but he's a very professional, experienced Army officer. He graduated from West Point in 1833 and served in the Mexican War. He, fought against the Seminoles. He was very distinguished as an artillerist. He was an artilleryman with the 4th U.S. Artillery, I believe, and served throughout places in the South, various forts. Many artillery units would garrison forts such as, Fort, Washington, just outside of Washington, D.C. They garrisoned New Orleans, places like Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie. So it was very coastal and disproportionate, a lot in the South. He was out at Pensacola. But probably most significantly, in addition to those various postings in the South, he marries a woman named Martha Thompson in 1848 at the conclusion of the Mexican War, and she hailed from Norfolk. So being married to a Southerner, having been stationed in many of these Southern states, slave states, he resigned his commission when the South seceded, despite the fact that his own 2 brothers fought for the Union. He spends much of his postings in, he was assistant adjutant general of the forces around Richmond. He took a commission. He was a colonel then. He's then given command in early 1862, of the Department of South Carolina, headquartered in Charleston. This is the most secessionist state, of course, and they really didn't like having this born Yankee. They didn't really trust him. And so he's ultimately moved west and given command of the forces in Mississippi, which had been really divided up to that point. into different elements. You had Sterling Price. He had elements of Confederate forces in Mississippi, and Earl Van Dorn had others. But ultimately, Pemberton comes, unifies his command, and all said, he has roughly 50,000 troops under his command when he takes over towards the end of October of 1862.
Okay, thank you. Now, there are a couple of phases to the Vicksburg campaign, isn't there? And I mean, the Vicksburg campaign actually technically starts, well, it does start in December 62. So give us an overview of the first few attempts that Grant is going to try to capture Vicksburg.
Okay, so the first attempt will be basically a two-pronged attempt, and a lot goes into this. I mean, you can write books about each phase of the Vicksburg campaign, and authors such as Tim Smith have done that. But what he'll try to do is he'll send, long story short, he wants to, one of his chief subordinates at Shiloh had been a guy named John C. McClernand. Kind of after Shiloh, before the expedition kicks off at Vicksburg, McClernand goes east to try to lobby for an independent command. He kind of wants to get out from under Grant. He'll get Grant, McClernand's a very influential Democrat, so Lincoln likes that, not because he's Democrat, because he isn't, but because he wants the support that McClernand can offer. And there's a famous photo of Lincoln meeting with McClellan after Antietam, and John C. McClernand is in that photo. So he wants his command. So he's basically sent to Illinois to recruit. He'll draw forces from Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, and will basically stage, not north of Memphis, he's actually in Kentucky at the time, but William T. Sherman is sitting in Memphis with an element of Grant's army, which would ultimately become the 15th Corps. And all these troops get funneled into Memphis that McClernand's recruiting. Grant gets wind that McClernand's going to show up soon, so basically Grant kicks Sherman out of Memphis and basically okay, you're going to launch my river-based attack on Vicksburg. So some will come down from Memphis, down the Mississippi, and will attempt to attack the riverside of Vicksburg. Simultaneously, Grant will move with McPherson's James B. Birdsey McPherson's 17th Corps down the Mississippi Central Railroad from Grand Junction, Tennessee, aiming for Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was a focal point on the railroad. Ultimately, to try to move down Grenada, Jackson, Vicksburg that way. Straight, on the map you can see he grants a right prong. Two things happen to sideline this attempt. The first thing for Grant, he moves south. He's moving towards Oxford, where the University of Mississippi has been located since forever. He's south of Holly Springs, but the Confederates launch a raid and basically destroy his supply depot. Contrary to opinion, Grant had learned from the surprise attack at Shiloh. He sent warnings. Ultimately, the defender at Holly Springs didn't get his cavalry out, didn't take precautions. The Confederates come in, sweep up a bunch of prisoners, destroy the depot, basically negating that expedition. Though ironically, in falling back, Grant lived off the land, so he learned something from that, because that would come into play later. The other prong, there's some discrepancy. Some authors say Grant got word to Sherman about the raid, that Sherman knew about the raid. But regardless, he launches his attack at a place called Chickasaw Bayou, which is just up the Yazoo River from Vicksburg. So coming down the Mississippi, he'll come to that point and then go northward briefly on the Yazoo, land at this place called Chickasaw Bayou, and we'll attack what's known as Haynes's Bluff, that area along the Yazoo that Sherman will strike. Bottom line, several days of attacks. Sherman's bloodily repulsed, and he falls back up the Mississippi. McClernand arrives in early January. He then moves to the west and takes a place called Arkansas Post, which is west of the Mississippi up the Arkansas River. It is a victory. Grant questions its value, says it's insignificant. I think it was probably in the end a valuable, after a repulse, it's always good to have a success, right?
Mm-hmm.
So McClernand does that. Grant, however, decides that, okay, we're just going to go down the river. We're going to try another option. I'm going to take command of, McClernand is not going to get this command because he does outrank Sherman, but Grant outranks him. So he'll come take command of the combined force. He'll continue a couple efforts. He'll begin what's called the Bayou operations, which stretch from January to March of 1863. The first would be to continue a canal that had been started on the, crossing from north of Vicksburg on the DeSoto Peninsula, which I don't know if you have a good picture of that, but Union troops had attempted a canal there to bypass the defenses at Vicksburg, cutting across this peninsula, having the water basically dig the canal, have the water burnt, once you flood it, it will widen the ditch, allow you to float boats through, bypass the defenses. Grant will attempt to do this. He'll waffle, right? He'll say, oh, I'm very optimistic about this, but then in other writings say, I never really had much hope. Bottom line is, what's it called? The gates are basically, the levees broke on it, which destroyed the canal, and by late March, the canal was abandoned. He'll try another expedition under McPherson's command, basically try and dig another canal linking the Mississippi to a watercourse known as Lake Providence. Through that, he'd go through a series of rivers all the way to south of Vicksburg, to Red River, and then into Vicksburg and come up by way of Port Hudson. That will be promising, but ultimately it's just too slow, too many overhanging trees, a lot of effort to do that. It did ultimately, the route was open, but it's, various historians, I think Ed Bars for one, called it the Lake Providence boondoggle, didn't really amount to anything. North of Vicksburg, he'll conduct two expeditions that are focused on the Yazoo River. He'll try one called the Yazoo Pass expedition. That will basically get blocked by Confederates building a fortification known as Fort Pemberton further up the Yazoo. In trying to extricate that expedition, they'll use what's called the Steele's Bayou and Steele's Bayou expedition to pull that, to outflank Fort Pemberton and to extricate those forces. Neither of those will work. So bottom line, Grant's doing that. The funny thing is that as soon as Grant gets down there, January, he realizes, and he writes it, that and some say McClernand had the idea too, but it's really common sense that the best way to do it would be to march down the Louisiana shore, run the batteries with the Navy, and land south of Vicksburg. Problem was up through March, the river's flooded, a lot of rain, it's wet where it's snow everywhere else, and all that snow melt, it raises the river further south. All the rain in the south will raise the river. So all the roads are flooded along the levees. But come April, end of March, early April, those roads are drying out, the water's dropping. This now becomes a viable plan, and that's ultimately what Grant will choose to do, to move down the west side and cross. And he has a very active partner through all of these operations. And one of the things that maybe he doesn't get enough credit for is beginning with Flag Officer Foote, with Belmont, Fort Henry, and Fort Donelson. Grant develops he knows working in the West means working on the rivers. To work on the rivers, you have to work with the Navy. Mm-hmm. So he developed great working relationships with these naval officers, Foote and then Admiral David Dixon Porter. And that will bear tremendous fruit during the main decisive phase of the Vicksburg campaign.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm going to get onto the running the batteries in a minute, but I just want to get your thoughts quickly on at this point. So, he's been trying literally everything. So what's the reaction from Washington at this point? Are they losing patience with Grant?
I'd say that they are losing patience, but they're never really close to firing him. I think Halleck at this point knows that if Grant can't do it, no one else can.
Hmm.
Uh, they are planning on ultimately handing, and this will come into play later, command of the expedition over to Nathaniel Banks, who a political general, very influential politician from Massachusetts, who's commanding operations along the Red River from New Orleans. But for those forces operating north of Vicksburg, they know that Grant's really probably their best bet.
Hmm.
He is taking action, and I think half of the reason he does most of these is just to show that he's busy. And there's some evidence that Grant believed that as long as his troops were kept busy, that was beneficial. And disease was rampant. Soldiers were constantly going into the hospital. They suffered horrible losses from disease. But how much worse would it have been if they'd just been sitting there in these malarial swamps and dealing with everything that comes with that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, and again, he's trying, isn't he? That's the main thing. He's trying everything that he can. Okay, let's talk about the important events leading up to the crossing of the Mississippi River. Obviously, so on April 16th, they are going to run the batteries at Vicksburg. So give us a little bit more detail about that amazing event.
So on April 16th, it was a clear night. Porter's troops staged north of all the main Union base was a town on the west bank of the Mississippi called Milliken's Bend at that time. The Porter will stage 7 gunboats and 3 empty troop transports on that night. It's a clear night with no moon, so that's great. You're just gonna see dark shapes. His troops will look to run the bluff defenses there at Vicksburg. Once dark hits, they'll start moving down the river. They were trying to minimize the light and noise. Ultimately, Confederate sentries found out, and Confederate batteries opened up. Tremendous cannonading. Grant witnessed it. Grant's wife was actually there. Ironically, only 13 men were wounded, no killed. The fleet survived with light damage. Only one boat, the Henry Clay, was disabled, and that was a transport. Every other boat made it. So all 7 gunboats and the other transports. So the first attempt was wildly successfue.
Something else happens the following day, and that is a cavalry raid into Mississippi.
So the raid you're talking about was Benjamin Grierson's raid. So Benjamin Grierson was a Midwestern officer, former music teacher, who ironically was scared of horses. He leads a 1,700-man cavalry raid. Grant had the idea. Well, some say Hurlbut had it, and he commanded one of Grant's corps up around Memphis, so he's responsible for funneling troops and such. Some say Grierson had the idea, some give it to Grant. Regardless, Grant had operational command, right? So he had to approve it. So Grierson moves from Grand Junction down what's called the Mississippi Central, Railroad, basically. Actually, he's east of that. Down basically through the heart of Mississippi, with the goal being to tear up track and basically cause all kinds of mischief, and then ultimately either link up with Grant's forces once they cross, or to head to Baton Rouge. So this is a lot. Some people don't credit this. Some people say, look at this as a key element of Grant's operations. Some will say it, impacted Grant's operations, but it was a totally separate thing. I think this was a brilliant piece of operational art, in my opinion, as we call it, in the military today. Grierson's raid, as Grant writes, he basically called it like one of the most brilliant cavalry operations of the war, basically. So Grierson is moving down from Grand Junction. He's aiming for locations east of Jackson. He goes through Starkville, which is where Mississippi State University is today, ultimately for a point on the Southern Railroad, which runs east from Jackson into, through Meridian, Mississippi, and ultimately into Alabama. He's aiming for a place called Newton Station. He damages the track there. This was very famously fictionalized in the John Wayne movie, The Horse Soldiers. But these various operations and detachments Grierson makes, he sends his unhealthy troopers back at some point and throws the Confederate cavalry off. Pemberton's having to basically send his cavalry willy-nilly, trying to respond to all this. And bottom line, Grierson will ultimately cause heavy damage, move about 600 miles, so a tremendous amount, killing or wounding only about 100 Confederates, capturing about 500 more. He's going to destroy about 50, 60 miles worth of railroad, weapons, captured horses and mules. And Pemberton has very little cavalry, and what little cavalry he has basically takes his eyes off of Grant. So I think it was a truly overlooked, element. Probably the most recent book was written by Tim Smith, who wrote a book-length study on the operation, and that was really his labor of love. Really good book. But both historians such as Ed Bars praise that as having an outsized impact on distracting Pemberton from Grant's operations on the west side of the river.
Okay, so on April 22nd, 1863 as well, there's another attempt at running the batteries, isn't there, Tim? So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so after the first attempt was successful, another 6 boats will move to run the batteries. One won't make it. None are killed. They end up floating downriver on the wreckage, but 5 boats make it, along with supplies. So all told, that made it 7 gunboats and 7 transport ships run the batteries between the two events on the 16th and the 22nd.
Okay, so that puts him in a very good position. Okay, so let's move on to an event that happens on the 29th of April. And Sherman feints an attack north of Vicksburg. Now, this is obviously in anticipation of the 30th, which is going to be the crossing. But there's also something that's going to happen at Grand Gulf, which we'll get into in a minute. But can you just tell us a little bit about Sherman's feint attack and the idea behind that?
Okay, yeah. So Sherman will feint, basically launch like a minor attack north of Vicksburg against what's called Snyder's Bluff, kind of in the same vicinity of where he had attacked in December. All these operations between Yazoo Pass and Steele's Bayou expedition, Grant's Mississippi Central Campaign, and Battle of Chickasaw Bayou were fixated on the defenses north of Vicksburg. Milken's Bend, the Union base, is north of Vicksburg. So by feinting there, in conjunction with the other operations with Grierson's raid, Grant's intent, as he said, was to compel Pemberton to keep as much force about Vicksburg as he could. So that's what Sherman was intending to do. And it was not an insignificant force. He kept his entire 15th Army Corps there to distract Pemberton, and in conjunction with the other operations, it worked.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, let's move on to April 30th because there's a couple of events that happen on that day. But first of all, I'd like you to tell us about the Grand Gulf. So obviously, Admiral Porter's Brownwater Navy is going to attack a Grand Gulf. Is that correct? So tell us a little bit more detail about what their aim is there and what happens at Grand Gulf.
So by the time, so Porter runs the batteries there, he's got gunboats out, 7 ironclads south of Vicksburg, in vicinity of a Confederate bastion known as Grand Gulf, which is on the east side of the Mississippi. Meantime, the McClernand's 13th Army Corps has moved down to a place called Hard Times, Louisiana, which is directly opposite Grand Gulf. They've identified Grand Gulf as a very strategic location from which they can build up a supply base for Grant's drive inland. So Porter will attack 2 Confederate forts. One's Fort Wade, the other is Fort Coburn, Cobun. And he'll silence Fort Wade, but Fort Coburn's higher up, and they'll damage Porter's fleet. They'll basically decide that they can't silence the Confederate batteries totally, so they'll basically break it off. And that tells Grant that it won't be feasible for him to make the landing as planned at Grand Gulf. He's going to have to look elsewhere. They decide that day, through with the aid of a runaway slave, they identified that a town south of Grand Gulf known as Bruinsburg will be a better location. So Grand Gulf is still important, but Grant's decided, because the attack fails, that he's going to have to look elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But before we get into the crossing of the river, I just wanted to ask you about, because I understand that the Mississippi River is not the same as it was in 1863. So I just want you to explain that quickly before we move on to the crossing.
Great photo.
And yes, this photo was taken by yourself, Tim, yes.
So if you're looking at this photo, this is taken from a Confederate fort north of Vicksburg known as Fort Hill. And it's looking at what was the hairpin bend of the Mississippi, that land right in the middle of the river. That was the eastern tip, so to speak, of the DeSoto Peninsula. So the river ran around there pretty much from the tip of the river. It, shot off to the northeast, and that was the Yazoo River. The Mississippi continued running up towards the center of the photo. Ironically enough, about a decade after the Civil War, just in an overnight incident, the Mississippi River broke through the DeSoto Peninsula and changed its course completely bypassing Vicksburg, basically doing what the canal was intended to do back in 1862, but it just happened naturally. And literally overnight, the Mississippi diverted, and Vicksburg was no longer a river town. It wasn't until decades later that they made a canal and basically connected the Yazoo to the Mississippi and remade Vicksburg, through man-made efforts into a river town once again. But yes, since then, the Mississippi, as it's wont to do, if you just look at it, there's a bunch of old Mississippi riverbeds along both sides of the river. It frequently changes course, and that was just one. It's, unfortunately for Grant, it happened 10 years too late.
Definitely, yeah. But that's a cool little bit of, extra little bit of history there if people don't realise, But yeah, I wanted to bring that in because I knew that was important. Okay, let's talk about the most important thing, and this is obviously on April 30th, 1863. After well, it's around about 6 months, isn't it? Grant and the Army of the Tennessee finally crossed the river at Bruinsburg. So, talk us through that, please.
Yep. So after the repulse of Porter's ironclads at Grand Gulf, Grant will decide to land at Bruinsburg. It is an uncontested crossing. They land the entirety of McClernand's corps plus one division of McPherson's. Sherman will receive word to come on down, so he'll move, back down the West Bank, and we'll cross later. Ultimately, the attack or the crossing successful, and Grant, will respond right later in his memoirs that with this affected, I felt a degree of relief scarcely felt before or since. And he mentioned how all the operations, the Bayou expeditions, the Mississippi Central, all of that was to accomplish this one object. It was, he acknowledged that there was a lot facing him ahead, that there was now a Confederate force between him and his base of supply, but that he was on dry ground on the same side of the river as the enemy. And he felt like he could do whatever he needed to do at this point. And, if you look at it, it's really hard to argue with him at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Start to build up at Bruinsburg, and then they need to basically get to Grand Gulf is their next step. So let's start moving up a series of roads towards a town known as Port Gibson, which lies basically just southeast of Grand Gulf. And Confederates are known to be in that area, and there will be conflict on May 1st. So I'll hold and see if you want me to talk about that.
Yes, please. So, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I was just going to let you go for it, But, yeah, so tell us about May 1st and the importance of Port Gibson, obviously. And I know you've mentioned Grand Gulf there. That was the main target. But strategically, how important is Port Gibson? And was it heavily defended?
No, the Confederates are led there by one of Pemberton's division commanders, a very competent officer named General John Bowen, who basically commands a division-sized force. His forces are spread out, though, but from south of Vicksburg through a town known as Warrenton all the way down to Grand Gulf. He only really has a brigade at that time. He on April 28th, he saw the buildup before the attack on Grand Gulf and is screaming for reinforcements. They don't get there until April 29th. Port Gibson itself is just a town on what's known as the Rodney Road, basically running up towards I think towards Vicksburg, towards Jackson. But it in of itself really isn't significant, other than the place that it is the place that the Union troops, the roads divide there. So Union troops are basically moving in that direction. So it's really the best place for Bowen to defend. They ran into them the night before, skirmished with them the night before, and attacked again on May 1st. There's not a lot of flanking. It's a lot of frontal attacks. The Confederates actually acquit themselves very well, but were pushed back. Just so the weight of numbers overwhelmed them. You have all of McClernand's 13th Army Corps against basically somewhere in the range of no more than a division, less than 7,000 guys. They couldn't stop the McClernand's advance. They fall back from defensive position to defensive position, ultimately leaving the field in the evening. And so the impact of that was that the Confederates can no longer defend a line along the Mississippi River. They're outflanked. Grant's, can take Grand Gulf. So Confederates abandon Grand Gulf and move north. And Bowen moves to link up with Pemberton's main army south of, to southern end of Vicksburg itself.
Mm-hmm. And so at this point, I understand that Pemberton thinks that Grant and his plan is to literally just go straight to Vicksburg. But obviously, we know he's not going to do that. And so, what was Grant's plan? And this is where it's just genius because we'll talk about it later. But this is probably one of the best campaigns you're ever going to see ever. You know,
Right.
and
So,
I know you agree with that. But what was what was his real plan?
so you have to understand Grant's, there is an element of Grant is taking the situation as it is, right? When Bowen leaves, he moves, he's trapped basically between us, they have different names for various water courses. There's one major river, it runs northeast off of Mississippi called the Big Black, north of Grand Gulf, and there's other bayous, one called Big Bayou Pierre. Bowen was initially trapped between the two. He crosses a place called Hankinson's Ford across the Big Black and is basically moving north towards Pemberton. Grant's initial plan is to take the exact same route, cross the Big Black and move directly against Pemberton. He finds, however, scouting parties report that Confederates have strong defenses on the south side of Vicksburg as well. So he very quickly abandons that plan. Keep in mind, he's also, his initial orders from Halleck, the commander, nominal commander of all Union forces in the country, were to build up a base of supply at Grand Gulf and then detach troops, McClernand's corps, to aid Nathaniel Banks in capturing Port Hudson. After that, Banks would come up. He would take command because he was the ranking major general, and Grant would basically lose credit for any success that followed. He's coordinating with Banks, however, who says that he is unprepared to begin operations against Port Hudson until May 10th. So Grant says, I have the initiative. I'm just going to go for it, basically. So he will build up a base of supply. There's a lot of debate in Vicksburg circles about what the term cut loose from his base means. At this point, he decides that he's going to move up, three-pronged advance, keeping the Big Black River on his left. He'll have McClernand along the Big Black, Sherman in the center, James B. McPherson's 17th Corps on the right, moving up towards the railroad, the Vicksburg-Jackson Railroad. Keep using the Big Black to shield his flank. McClernand will be aiming initially for a point called Midway Station, which is because it's midway between Jackson and Vicksburg. Sherman for a place called Edwards Station on the same railroad, and McPherson's heading up kind of in vicinity of Jackson. So it's really a three-pronged advance. He is living off the land. They're really only moving with what they can carry, though wagons are, at this point, moving up from Grand Gulf to reinforce with necessities. But Grant, learning his lesson from when he fell back from the disaster at Holly Springs the previous fall, he knows that the countryside can supply his needs considerably. So that's what they will initially set out to do.
Mm-hmm. And so the next battle they are going to get to is known as the Battle of Raymond, which happens on May 12th. So again, what was the importance of Raymond? And tell us a little bit about the battle there.
So Raymond, in and of itself, is not overly significant as a physical location. That was the location where Pemberton was basically ordering all reinforcements that were then arriving in Jackson. They ordered them to march about 20 miles southwest to the town of Raymond. It was astride Grant's supposed line of advance. It was astride specifically the 17th Corps' line of advance under James B. McPherson. Really, all they have there is an overstrength brigade under a guy named Brigadier General John Gregg, who later in the war will become commander of the more famous Texas Brigade in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. that force had undergone a lot of stress, had marched all the way overland from Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is, as I mentioned, way south from Vicksburg. They arrived in Raymond. They arrived in Jackson on the 10th. They got to Raymond on the 11th. On the 12th, they moved south to ambush a raiding party along what was known as 14 Mile Creek, south of Raymond. It wasn't a raiding party, however. It was General John Blackjack Logan's division of the 17th Corps. That battle, Gregg will fight very well. Unfortunately, McPherson doesn't fight as well, but kind of like with Port Gibson, eventually federal numbers cold, and the Confederates under Gregg were ultimately forced to withdraw. That, however, told Grant something. It basically said there are forces along his right flank. He had to do something about that. He also gets wind that General Joseph E. Johnston was due in Jackson. He's basically the Confederate theater commander. So Grant decides that he has to deal with Jackson. So he'll turn much of his army after the Battle of Raymond to address the threat posed by Johnston's forces there at Jackson.
Mm-hmm. And I was just about to get onto that, actually. So, yeah, the Battle of Jackson. And I know you mentioned Joseph Johnson there, and we'll bring him in. So what has Joseph E. Johnson been doing since, his wounding, basically? And then, of course, command gets handed over to Robert E. Lee, doesn't it? So what's Joseph Johnson been doing within that time? And how does he end up being posted out into the Western Theater?
So Joseph E. Johnson's, he looms large in, Civil War history. He's in co-command of Confederate forces at First Manassas. He is still in command of what will become the Army of Northern Virginia at the beginning of George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862. He, however, he withdraws in back towards Richmond and fights at a place called Seven Pines, and where he's wounded, and command is then turned over to Robert E. Lee. Following that, he was basically in the hospital. I mean, it was a pretty grievous wound. He stayed in the hospital until November of 1862, and then was appointed to command the Department of the West, as it was called, which was the principal department of the Western Theater. In part he's there because he's away from Jefferson Davis. The two didn't get along, and they never really would. Basically by being appointed to that command, however, he's a theater commander in charge of two separate armies. You have John C. Pemberton's Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana, as Pemberton's command is called, and he's also in charge over Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. Which, following, has basically just been staring at the Army of the Cumberland ever since the Battle of Stones River at the end of 1862, first day of 1863. Mm-hmm. So really the biggest threat is to Pemberton's army. So on May 9th, he's basically ordered by the Confederate War Department and Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, to take command of forces in the field, and arrives at Jackson on May 13th, so the day after the Battle of Raymond.
Okay, so talk a little bit about the actual Battle of Jackson then, and what happens there then, if you wouldn't mind.
So basically, Gregg is once again in command of the troops in the field. He has about 6,000 troops available to defend the city. He's already been ordered, or the evacuation of Jackson's already been ordered by Johnson. He doesn't have the forces to respond to fight against up to three corps, two of which he knows of. He's aware of Sherman and McPherson's corps advancing on him at Jackson. So he basically orders Gregg with his 6,000 troops to defend south of the city. both Union corps were near Jackson by about 10 o'clock in the morning. The Confederates, there wasn't much fighting. It was rainy. Union forces attacked in heavy numbers after 11 o'clock and basically start pushing Confederates back slowly but surely. The evacuation was complete mid-afternoon. Johnson informed Gregg to basically get the hell out. So Gregg withdrew, and Union troops moved in and captured the capital of state.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, like you said, it's the rail hub, isn't it, into Vicksburg? So again, it was that the importance of Jackson really for the Union.
I mean, at that point, really, that's a big part of it. You know, there's a couple ways that you can get at Vicksburg, right? You can try to get it by the riverside. You can try come through the bluffs north of town, or you can go overland. And the best way to do that is via the series of railroads.
Mm-hmm.
But by cutting the railroad at Jackson, that's basically the last Confederate line of supply into Vicksburg. All the railroads filter in through Jackson, and there's just that one line. So by cutting it, you've basically sealed Vicksburg off. It's already cut off to the north and south. Union troops control the west bank of the river. Porter's sitting there with his ironclads, which are intimidating menaces to the Confederates. So yes, at that point, Vicksburg's basically completely sealed off.
Mm-hmm. And again, what happened to Johnson's guys? Where did they end up going after the Battle of Jackson?
They moved off to the north of Jackson.
Okay, yeah, because obviously the one of the reasons why Grant does what he does is because he doesn't want the enemy in his back, does he? So, is that threat completely eliminated from the Battle of Jackson?
No, and Grant is way aware of the threat that Joseph John. He's aware. He's receiving reports basically up until the fall of Vicksburg that Johnson's building a force, and he is receiving reinforcements, but never of the magnitude that Grant sometimes fears.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't destroy. He does damage Johnson by pushing him out, kills, captures, and wounds a bunch of guys at Jackson, but doesn't eliminate the threat completely. So that will prove a menacing threat to the rest of the campaign. Mm-hmm. But Grant will address it as he moves along.
Okay, so now attention turns to a place called Champion Hill, doesn't it, on May 16th? So talk us through that, please.
Right. So while Sherman and McPherson were moving on Jackson on May 14th, McClernand is sitting on that railroad, Vicksburg-Jackson Railroad, or in that vicinity. He engages, starts skirmishing with Pemberton's forces, who Pemberton has finally left the Vicksburg fortifications, moved out to the east with much of his army to a place called Edwards Station. He receives word from Joe Johnson that, he's ordered to attack. So Pemberton will move away from Edwards Station, move to east, and will fight in vicinity of a place called Champion's Hill, which is known for the farm that sits at the top of it, which is owned by the Champion family. After capturing Jackson, Sherman will basically handle the destruction of the military stores, but Grant will immediately push McPherson to the west. So he's actually coming in from the railroad, moving from Jackson. So it will primarily be McPherson's fight. And this is a frustration to Grant because he gives orders at the beginning of the day for McClernand to attack in a certain direction. And McClernand basically doesn't move. So much of the fighting will be between Pemberton's forces there, which hold a north-south running line along the crest of Champion Hill, and McPherson's forces. It's a seesaw battle. Union troops will effect a breakthrough, and then the Confederates will counterattack and push them back. Eventually, reinforcements, I think under Logan, basically overwhelm the Confederate right flank. McClernand shows up on the south, and it forces the Confederate line on Champion Hill become unhinged, and basically leads to a rout. The fighting had begun early in the morning, about 7 a.m. By 11:30, they reached the Confederate main line and took the crest in the early afternoon, causing Confederates to basically to rout. Bowen, who had held it at Port Gibson, fights a really good rear guard action. Bowen's nominal superior is a guy named General Loring. He basically does not retreat with the rest of the army, but escapes, worms his way out, and ultimately links up with Joe Johnson. But that ultimately serves to reduce the available forces that Pemberton has to hold Vicksburg when he moves back that way.
Awesome. And of course, that will lead on to the following day, which is known as a Battle of the Big Black River. Is that more of a defensive type retreat type battle for Pemberton at that point?
Kind of. He's trying to impede Grant's pursuit and movement on Vicksburg. It's a very, haphazard defense. Not very. I would not call it full-throated, but once again, it's John Bowen's division, 3 brigades, manning fortifications on the East Bank, which is interesting. Why would you defend the East Bank when you're there? But they did, and ultimately the Union forces push them back. Really, they rout them easily, and the Confederates are thrown back across the river. I don't think they even destroyed the bridge across. But regardless, the Confederates did burn the bridges, sorry, but that really didn't hold them up substantially, because that battle's fought on the 17th of May. Mm-hmm. And by the 19th, Grant's in front of Vicksburg, so it really didn't delay him at all.
Yeah, that's right. And so what I was going to ask you is, what was the impact on Pemberton's army after these 2 battles? And of course, what is next for Pemberton and the Confederate Army?
Well, at that stage, they've lost. They lost at Port Gibson. They lost at Raymond. They lost at Jackson. They've lost at Champion Hill and the Big Black. So what is that?
5. Yeah,
5. They've lost 5 significant battles. They failed to prevent Grant moving across the river. They lost the stronghold at Grand Gulf. Grant, their defenses along Warrenton, which were almost as strong as the ones at Vicksburg, are worthless now, and Grant's forces have routed them and defeated them in all these battles. So they're very disorganized. And Grant is very aware of this at that point.
So what was the difference between the 2 armies on this occasion? Because the Confederates don't seem like they put up, a great fight, really. The wind is in the sails of the Union Army on this. Is it numbers? Is it what is it that?
Well, first of all, I think the Vicksburg campaign was very audacious. So audacity sometimes carries the day. But if you look at Port Gibson, Raymond, Big Black, Champion Hill, in those battles, the Union forces have the numbers. The Confederates fight very well, but they just don't have the numbers. They're not really acting in concert. You have generals moving, like General Loring moving away from Pemberton's his commander, but he basically says, I'm done with Pemberton, and moves off with his division up to, a large division to link up with Johnson instead of supporting his commander and heading back that direction. So I think that's a major factor. The Union Army is very well led, and has a lot of experience. Much of Pemberton's army, most of the experienced troops from Shiloh, those are forces that eventually moved to the Army of Tennessee, not to be confused with the Army of the Tennessee, but Braxton Bragg's army is the remnants of much of those troops that were at Shiloh. So not a lot of combat experience, so to speak, in Pemberton's army. So yeah, they're not cohesive. They're not as well led, but they do engage in some rather valiant fighting, though wildly outnumbered.
Hmm. And as you said, the siege of Vicksburg will start on May. Is it May 18th? The siege starts
Well,
technically.
it's all a matter of definitions. Technically, no. The siege doesn't really begin until May 23rd. So
Okay.
for short, so they basically arrive in front of Vicksburg, on May 19th. Grant orders an attack. Ultimately, only elements of Sherman's corps attacks are bloodily repulsed on the northern side of
Hmm.
the defenses. So Grant says, okay, we're going to take a couple days. He has now captured Haynes Bluff. Remember this location north of Vicksburg that's been stymieing him for the last 5-6 months. He's now got this location on the Yazoo River, which means he can resupply. He doesn't need
Hmm.
to rely on Grand Gulf, which actually he had cut off. Basically, by the time he got to Jackson, he cut off the supplies coming from Grand Gulf. So he has been living totally off the land for 4 or 5 days. Troops are hungry. They want hardtack. They shout to Grant, hardtack, hardtack. So they basically get the supply base at Haynes Bluff open. He orders an attack synchronized on watches for May 22nd. They're bloodily repulsed.
Hmm.
Sherman lives in the same general area. One of those killed in that attack, I think it was that day, it may have been the 19th, was actually the grandnephew of George Washington in the 13th U.S. Infantry. He was killed along what was known as the Graveyard Road outside a Confederate fortification known as the Stockade Redan.
Hmm.
McPherson doesn't have any luck in the center, but on the south, McClernand and his 13th Corps attacked what's known as the Railroad Redoubt south of the Vicksburg-Jackson Railroad. And he reports that he has a breakthrough. So the attacks have been halted to the north, Sherman and McPherson. McClernand says, I need support. I need support. I need you to renew these attacks. Grant's very hesitant and says so to Sherman. Sherman says, well, you can't disregard what another corps commander says. So Grant agrees and orders a resumption of the attacks. They fail. Turns out McClernand, a couple units had placed flags on top of the fortification, but really had no significant breakthrough. So that failed. So beginning the next day, May 23rd, Grant decides that he's going to outcamp the enemy. So they'll begin to reduce the stronghold of Vicksburg through what they called then regular approaches, which means dig a series of saps and parallels, moving ever closer to the defenses until you're so close that ultimately you're basically hopping over your trench and over their trench into their lines is the objective. And that's ultimately what they'll spend more than the next month doing, is
Hmm.
digging closer to Vicksburg, engaged in a very dirty war of artillery fire, sharpshooting. Grant heavily employs sharpshooters throughout the siege. So
There you go. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a podcast all on its own at some point. But yeah, and as we know, obviously the surrender will happen on July the 4th, 1863, which is 160th anniversary this year. But anyway, Tim, I want to talk to you about as far as campaigns go, where would you rank the Vicksburg campaign in military history?
well, that's going to be a divisive question, isn't it? If I'm looking at it through if I'm looking at American military history, I think the Vicksburg campaign is hands down the most audacious campaign of the Civil War and really of entire American military history. It's probably the most consequential. If for no other reason, and there is a lot more to it than this, because it truly launches Grant into that preeminent position that he'll occupy throughout the rest of the war. It demonstrated Grant's ability to execute what we call operational art, things like tempo, understanding what the enemy center of gravity is, in this case, the enemy center of gravity, wasn't so much the location as it was the army and the location, or the location and the army defending it, Pemberton's army. So Grant captures his second field army in the course of the war, and very few generals in military history have done that. It does sever, with the surrender of Port Hudson just a couple weeks after the fall of Vicksburg, and Vicksburg was by far the more formidable of the two. The Mississippi River is, as Lincoln had called it, Vicksburg was the key, and he couldn't, rest until the key was in his pocket, or bring the war to a conclusion until the key was in his pocket. By doing that, by capturing that key, it made, Port Hudson was going to fall. Whether Banks did it himself or Grant sent reinforcements, it was going to happen. So at that point, the Western Confederacy is split off. Yeah, I'm sure they can move some things across, but they've lost control of that artery. Union commerce can once again flow down the river. Union troops can move along the river with impunity, basically. So it's incredibly consequential, but I'd say it's most significant for launching Grant. And it's really hard to come up with a campaign that accomplished what it did, or achieved the results that it did, that the Vicksburg campaign did. I struggle. I mean, you look at things like Normandy. I don't, I'm into Normandy as well, but Vicksburg was just such an audacious campaign.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
US Army, the U.S. Army basically long ago, when they published their old field manual, I think 100-5, when they started looking at operations, basically identified Vicksburg as the most brilliant campaign in American military history. It's really hard to disagree.
Yeah, 100%. Again, 17 days, 200 miles, and 5 battles. So there you go. And so what was so when they end up actually outside of Vicksburg, what is the reaction from Washington at this point?
I think they're optimistic. Grant, there are side effects, right? So Grant very intentionally, when he decided that he wasn't going to go help Banks, he knew that any message back would have to go back across the river, all the way up the West Bank to a telegraph station, get relayed. It may take 7 days, a week for him to get a response. So by the time he's nearly at Vicksburg, by the time, they've, word is reaching him. But they're rather, they're enthusiastic. Lincoln's happy. Halleck really, he is friendly with Banks, but he doesn't really throw much of a fit about it, because they can see what Grant has done. At that point, what are they really going to tell him? So I'd say the response from Washington is enthusiastic.
Yeah. And so just before we finish up here, anything that we may have missed or that you wanted to add before we close up here?
No, not really. I think that about sums it up.
Okay. Well, then all that's left to say, Tim, is thank you very much and cheers.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.